So now we've looked at the gross anatomy of the spinal cord, we've looked at the anatomy of a cross section of the spinal cord, and we understand that information is sent through the spinal cord from the brain to the body. Motor information is sent that way, and sensory information is sent from the body toward the brain. So we know the spinal cord plays a role there. We also understand the anatomy of the cross section of the spinal cord. So we know we have gray matter, those horns that are there that contain the cell bodies, and then we have white matter, right? That's made up of the axons of these neurons. Now, the axons of these neurons, which is making up the white matter, these are collected, or these sort of are arranged in tracks. So remember, white matter is myelinated. The signals on myelinated axon travels much faster because of that saltatory conduction, right, which can skip from node to node. It skips where the insulated myelin is at. So what we are going to do is look at both sensory pathways and motor pathways today. Big picture, just make sure we understand that sensory pathways, right, are collecting information from our receptors in our body, our skin, our muscles, and the cell bodies of these we know are going to exist in the dorsal root ganglion. So sensory pathways are collecting information up to the brain. So these are ascending pathways. And typically what we're going to see is that these are going to contain 3 neurons, a primary, a secondary, and a tertiary. Now, these are also called, so the primary would also be called first order. The secondary would be second order. And the tertiary would be third order. So unfortunately, in anatomy and physiology, we have a lot of things that are known by more than one name. We'll look at the details of some of these pathways. Now, I want to stress the important thing is to understand and not so much just memorize. So as long as we understand what's happening, it's easy for us to know and understand where these neurons are at and what's synapsing with what. Now, we do have a situation where we will have some tracks with only 2 neurons, but typically we're going to see 3. Now, in our motor pathway, that's the opposite, right? This is information that's being sent from the brain toward the skeletal muscles. So this is going to be a descending pathway. I do want to just point out something that's review. We've already covered the brain. And so we know that this area of the brain, right, that is the gray matter, this is the cerebral cortex. But we also know something about the areas of the cerebral cortex and some of the functions that happen in these certain areas. So when we're talking about sensory information in the cerebral cortex, do you remember where on the cerebral cortex is sensory information integrated or processed? So stop your video, see if you remember that, and then come back. So this area is called the post-central gyrus. This is where sensory information is processed. So it is in the parietal lobe, right? Just posterior to that large sulcus, the central sulcus. Now, what about our motor information? Where is it beginning? Okay, stop your video, see if you can remember. So this is going to be the precentral gyrus, okay? And this is part of the frontal lobe. So let's move on. We'll talk a little more in detail about how these different pathways. So if we summarize what we talked about on the last slide and sort of the general overview for these, our sensory tracts, we have sometimes 2, more often 3 neurons, and they can either be called primary or first order. Then the next one's secondary or second order, tertiary or third order. And these are ascending because we're getting information from the body, right? Sensory information being sent up to the brain. So this is going to begin in the spinal cord, and of course it ends in the brain. two examples of tracks or pathways that we're going to look at are the spinocerebellar and the spinothalamic. So if we just look at those names, that tells us where it begins and where it ends. So spino is the first word that begins in the spinal cord. Cerebellar, that means it ends in the cerebellum. Then the spinothalamic, it begins in the spinal cord and it's going to end in the thalamus. Now, the first order neuron, right, or that primary neuron, we know that the cell body of that neuron, because we're talking about sensory information, is going to be in the dorsal root ganglion, right? That's where those cell bodies are from the receptors that are coming in. Now, the second order neuron we're going to look at, depending on the pathway, or the cell body of the second order neuron, is going to be located in the spinal cord, in the dorsal gray horn, okay? What kind of information are we receiving through this pathway, this somatosensory pathway? So our sensitive and crude touch, our pressure, pain, temperature, balance, and position. Now, if we switch to our motor tracks, so these are typically, so we actually have a direct pathway, which is what we're going to focus on. There are indirect pathways, which this has to do with subconscious control of our skeletal muscles. So we'll put that on hold. And then when we talk about the autonomic nervous system, we'll talk about that a little more. But in our direct pathways, this is conscious control of our skeletal muscle. And these are going to involve both an upper and lower motor neuron. So it's important that we don't get these confused. In our motor tracks, we're talking about upper and lower motor neurons. So upper in the brain, right? The lower is going to be in the spinal cord. Our sensory tracks are our primary, secondary, and tertiary, or first, second, and third order neurons. Now we know our motor tracks are descending because we're going from the brain to the body. So if we think about the lower motor neuron, if we're talking about direct pathway, and we're talking about motor tracks, right? So somatic motor, then our lower motor neuron, where is it going to be located? So we know that this is going to be in the anterior gray horn of the spinal cord, right? Because the anterior horn is what deals with our somatic motor. Anterior gray horn, spinal cord. Now, I want to review just for a second because we're talking about the sensory pathway first. And we're talking about what kind of information. So we have these different types of touch, pressure, pain, temperature. So we're going to do a quick review of some of the tactile receptors that we learned about when we talked about the integumentary system. All right, so here's our skin model. So it's been a little while since we've covered this, but hopefully it will become a little bit familiar to you. So we have something called Merkel cells, okay? And Merkel cells can be called tactile cells also. These are those that are responsible for our sensitive, so the touch like in our fingertips where you can tell the texture of something, right? These are located in that outer layer of skin. You know, we have the dermis, then we have the epidermis. So these are located in the epidermis. And specifically, you know, the epidermis, remember, we have different layers. So for thick skin, we have 5 layers of the epidermis. And so this is going to be in the deepest layer of the epidermal tissue. And we can see it right here. Here's our, actually, we don't see it shown on the model, I'm sorry. Now, if we look at the model, just as a review, this right here, these little papillae, right? This is the differentiation, right, between the epidermis. So the epidermis is that in the blue layer, and below that, right, is the dermis until we get down here, right, to the hypodermis. So that's our hypodermis. Up here in the blue layer is our epidermis. And then between that is our dermis. So these Merkel cells, which we don't really have one shown, would be in this top epidermal layer, right? In the basement layer, or the stratum basale, that deepest layer of the epidermis. That's where we would find those sensitive light touch cells. Now, the tactile corpuscle, also called Meissner's corpuscles, this is found in the dermal layer. Okay, so the dermal layer is also, remember, divided into two layers. Can you name those? So it's the papillary layer. So the dermal papillae would be that papillary layer. And then we have the reticular layer. So we see here is an example, okay, of these Meissner's corpuscles that are in the papillary layer of the dermis. Now, our deeper coarse pressure touch is deep in the dermis. So these would be our lamellated corpuscles that are responsible, which makes sense, right? When you're talking about deep pressure, coarse touch, it would make sense that those would be deeper in our integumentary system. So it's just a quick review to remind you that we're putting these things together, right? We know where these are at in our integument, and now we can see what's going to happen. Where do the nerves, right, the receptors, when they come out of our skin, right, then what happens? How does that information get to our brain? And that's what we're going to cover as we go through this lecture video. So the first pathway that we're going to talk about, so we're talking about a sensory pathway. And I know that because I can see that the information is traveling up, right? It's an ascending pathway. So I know it's a sensory pathway. So I'm just going to write here. Now, the other way that I know that the direction is ascending is by the name of the pathway. Spino, which means spinal cord. Thalamic, or thalamic, which means our thalamus, right? So that means it's going from the spinal cord to the thalamus, so it's ascending to the brain. Now, another name for this pathway is the anterolateral. So if you divide that in half, right, that's talking about there can be two different tracks of white matter that this travels on depending on where in the body and the type of information. So we have, just like we had anterior, lateral, and posterior or dorsal horns in the gray matter, we also have areas of the white matter that we designate, right, by anterior, lateral. And I'm not asking you to memorize what goes down which anterior or lateral spinal thalamic tract. I just want you to see that it can be named that, and there are two different tracks, right, that this travels down. Now let's review our brain, because I want to point out a couple of things. So we have this central sulcus, right? That's the division between the frontal. So this is anterior. And then this would be posterior. So we have this central sulcus, that's the division between our frontal lobe and our parietal lobe. And that's important because just on the posterior side of the frontal lobe, we have something called the precentral gyrus. And this is important in our motor. Okay, so we're going to see this several times as we talk today about our motor pathways. But the most anterior part of the parietal lobe, right, is our postcentral gyrus. And this is where our sensory information is collected. So remember when we talked about the brain and we had those maps called the homunculi, and we looked at the sizes of the part on the body that the sensory or the motor information is either coming from or going to, and it was like the fingers were very large and the sensory information. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the precentral gyrus, or the motor cortex, and then the postcentral gyrus, the sensory cortex. Okay, now let's dive into this pathway, the spinal thalamic pathway. So our primary, or our first order neuron, right, this is the one that's bringing the sensory information in. So for example, from our skin, right, could be crude touch, it could be temperature, pressure, So the cell body of this primary neuron is in our dorsal root ganglion, right? That's where all of the cell bodies for our sensory information that's coming into the somatosensory information coming into the spinal cord will be. Now notice that first neuron is shown here in purple, and we can see that it synapses with the secondary or the second order neuron right here in the spinal cord, and we know that that's happening in the dorsal or the posterior horn because that's the horn that deals with sensory information. And then, so the second order neuron, notice that something important here happens. So it crosses over to the other side. So that's called decussation. When we have the signal crossing, the track crosses the midline. So when that happens, we call that contralateral. If it stays on the same side, we call it ipsilateral. So this one is going to cross over, so it's contralateral. And so we see there are two options, right? We have the anterior spinothalamic tract. That's because it's coming from this anterior funiculus, or this tract from the anterior white matter. The other one is coming from the lateral. Okay, again, I'm not going to ask you to memorize what kind of information these two tracts carry. I just want us to understand. So if I ask you something about the spinal thalamic tract, you can look at the name, know it originates in the spinal cord. It's going to end up in the brain or the thalamus, and that it's carrying sensory information and it's ascending. Now let's look at how it works. So this secondary neuron, okay, the cell body is in the posterior gray horn, but the axon is going to extend all the way up to the thalamus, okay? It's going to synapse there in the thalamus. Now, the thalamus, remember, is our filter, right? This is going to filter and determine where this information needs to go in the cerebral cortex. So if you think about it, if you're wearing clothes, right? If there's background noise where you are, things like that, the thalamus is constantly filtering out information that doesn't need to go to the cerebral cortex or that does. So the third order or the tertiary neuron then is extending from the thalamus to that primary somatosensory area, right, in that postcentral gyrus of the parietal lobe, okay? So that's the end of that. Now, what do we need to take away from this? Again, I don't want you to memorize, but I want you to understand, so then there's no reason to memorize. Spinothalamic starts in the spinal cord. The last cell body of the neuron is in the thalamus, right? It's ascending, which means it must be carrying sensory information, okay? This one has 3 neurons because there's one that the cell body is in the dorsal root ganglion. The second one has a cell body in the dorsal gray horn. The third cell body is in our thalamus that filters the information to send it to the cerebral cortex. Okay, so let's move on and look at another pathway. So this one is called the spinocerebellar. So we already know spino means it originates in the spinal cord. Cerebellar means, what do you think? Cerebellum, right? Now, this one is different in that it only has 2 neurons. So we only have a first order and a second order, or primary and secondary. Now, what I also want to point out to you is this one, because it doesn't make its way to the cerebral cortex, right? It's sub or below the brain or the cerebral cortex. So this would be subconscious information. So this is not something that you're consciously aware of. Okay, so what kinds of things, when we talked about the cerebellum, when we learned about the brain, what kinds of things do you think would be important that the cerebellum would integrate and regulate? So pause the video and see if you can remember that. So balance, right? We talked about balance. We talked about posture. So these are the things that are subconscious that you're not having to think about, your body position. So these would be coming from proprioceptors. Okay. Now, the primary neuron is still going to have its cell body, right, in the dorsal root ganglia, because that's how all of our sensory neurons have their cell bodies there. So proprioceptive information from our joints, right? This is somatic. So it's from our joints, our muscles, our tendons, if there's a stretch, right, where the position is. So these are going to synapse in the spinal cord, okay? Now, the difference is that second order neuron is going to extend to the cerebellum, and that's it, right? It doesn't go higher than that, so we only have 2 neurons. Now, this one also, notice we have one pathway that is going to decussate, right? Where we have another pathway that is not. So we have a contralateral pathway, and then we have an ipsilateral pathway. Okay, now this pathway is a mouthful. The posterior funiculus medial lemniscal pathway. So again, we're going to look at the terms, okay, so we can figure out where it's originating. The posterior funiculus, remember the funiculi are the white matter tracts, right? Posterior is just talking about where in the spinal cord that white matter would be located. So this is coming from the spinal cord, right? Specifically the posterior funiculus. Now, medial lemniscal, what is that referring to? Okay, this is referring to this medial lemniscus, okay, that is in the midbrain. So we know that starting in the spinal cord, this term is referring to the midbrain. So we know it's an ascending pathway, right? It must be a sensory ascending pathway. Now notice that our other 2 pathways, the name was where it started and where the cell body ended, right? Of the secondary, of the final neuron. In this case, we do have a neuron located in the thalamus, so it does continue up to reach the somatosensory cortex in the cerebral cortex. Let's look at how this functions. So again, same thing, cell body located in the posterior root ganglion. Now I want to point out, look at all of the types of information these sensory neurons are collecting. So we're getting the fine discriminative touch, precise pressure, vibration, proprioception. A lot of information is being collected and sent through this particular tract. Okay, now this neuron, the 2 before, we saw that this primary or first order neuron was going to synapse in one of the gray horns of the spinal cord. This one, in fact, doesn't. Okay, this one is going to synapse with a second order neuron in the medulla oblongata. Okay, so we see this happening right here. Okay, so up to that point, we're on the same side of the body, but the secondary neuron is going to decussate right to the other side. Notice that this is this medial lemniscus located in the medulla oblongata, right? This is crossing over at this point at the medulla oblongata level, just prior to the medial meniscus. And then this second order neuron is going to synapse with the tertiary or third order neuron at the level of the thalamus. And remember, the thalamus, again, what is the thalamus here in this information? What is this important for? And that's for filtering, right? Filtering information. So as I wear my clothes, I don't need to have information sent to my brain constantly that my shirt is rubbing my arm, right? That needs to be filtered out. I need to be focusing on other things. So the thalamus is performing that filter function for us. Now, again, sensory information, right? Somatosensory information, always going to the postcentral gyrus, our primary somatosensory sensory cortex in the brain. Okay, located in which lobe? The parietal lobe. Okay, now that's going to be the last example we look at for our sensory pathways. We're going to look at one example of a motor pathway next. Okay, this name doesn't look quite so challenging as the last one. So cortico, okay, and spinal. Cortico is talking about our cortex, right? So we're talking about the gray matter, right? The cortex of the brain, and then spinal, of course, the spinal cord. So we start in the brain at the cortex and we end up in the spinal cord. So we know this one must be descending. Descending. Sorry about that. Therefore, if it's descending, it must be motor, right? Because that information comes from the brain down. Now remember, we have our precentral gyrus just anterior to the central sulcus, and that's where our motor information is coming from in our cerebral cortex. So we have the pathway direction. We're starting in the brain and we're going down. We have now in this case, we have a motor pathway, right? So we don't have primary, secondary, and tertiary. We have upper motor and we have lower motor. Okay. Now, the pathway I'm showing you here is a direct pathway. A direct pathway is going to have two neurons, the upper and lower. I just want to make sure that I do mention there is also an indirect pathway. And this indirect pathway would contain three neurons. So you would have an upper motor and two additional neurons. We're not going to cover the indirect pathway today, but it is involved in subconscious control, okay, of our skeletal muscle. So the direct pathway that we're looking at right here, this corticospinal tract, this is our conscious control of skeletal muscle. So I want to, reach out and pick up my coffee cup and take a drink. That's an example of what's happening in this pathway. All right, so we have our primary or upper motor neuron in our primary motor cortex. And notice that it is synapsing down in the spinal cord, right, with the lower motor neuron. And the lower motor neuron then is going to travel out of the anterior horn. Anterior gray horn, because the anterior horn, right, is that part of the spinal cord that deals with our motor signals to our skeletal muscles. So this lower motor neuron then is going to send the signal right out through the anterior root to the skeletal muscles of our body, of our trunk and our limbs. So I wanted to clear some of that writing off so I could show you something else important. The first thing, though, I want to say is you can see that within this corticospinal tract, there's two different tracts. There's the anterior corticospinal tract and the lateral corticospinal tract. I'm not going to ask you to differentiate those two to tell me which one does which. Pardon me. Just an FYI, though, the lateral corticospinal tract is the one that's responsible for skilled type of muscle movement. So, if you are an athlete and you dribble a basketball and have, shoot the basketball, things like that, that's the lateral corticospinal. Or if you play the guitar, play a musical instrument, the anterior corticospinal tract is the one, it's more responsible for your axial skeletal muscles. So around the axis of your body, right? Not necessarily your limbs. But again, I'm not asking you to remember that. I just want you to see what I wanted to point out to you is that both of these tracts are going to decussate. So they cross the midline. So if we look, the lateral one is this one here, right over here. And we can see that it crosses, okay, at the medulla oblongata, Whereas the anterior corticospinal tract, it also decussates, but it does it down here in the spinal cord. You don't have to remember where those decussations happen. I just wanted to point out that they do both cross the midline or decussate. So if they're on the same side, we would call that ipsilateral. Okay, so let me just write this down. Same side is ipsilateral. And if they're on opposite sides, so in other words, the part of the body, right, where the information comes in based on where that information is being received, or vice versa, where it's being sent, in this case, to where it's being received. If it's on opposite sides, that would be contralateral. Okay, I will see you in the next video.